April 23rd, 1014. Good Friday. 7,000 armored men stood on a stretch of coastal marsh outside Dublin, waiting for the tide to decide their fate. By sunset, thousands of them were dead, drowned, or crushed beneath the weight of their own armor. The man responsible for that carnage was 73 years old and too frail by most accounts to even lift a sword. And yet he became the reason an entire Norse military alliance collapsed within a single bloody afternoon. This was not a border raid. This was not a quarrel over stolen cattle or unpaid tribute. This was the final reckoning between 2 centuries of Viking conquest and one old king's obsession with uniting a broken island under a single crown. Outside Ireland, almost nobody has ever heard his name. Inside Ireland, he is still remembered as the greatest king the island ever produced, centuries after his death. His name was Brian Boru, and the war he finished on that beach was never supposed to be winnable in the first place. Here is the strange part. The same forced loyalty that built his kingdom was the only thing that could save his life that day. And it did not hold. To understand why, we have to go back 200 years, to the day the raiders first arrived. To understand Clontarf, you first have to understand what Ireland actually looked like in the year 795. It was not one kingdom with a single throne and one standing army. How do you conquer an island that has never once agreed to be one country? It was a patchwork of more than 100 small kingdoms, called Tuatha, each ruled by its own local king. Above them sat a handful of provincial overkings, and above those, at least on paper, sat a single high king of all Ireland. In practice, that high king commanded loyalty the way a mayor commands a neighboring city, which is to say, almost none at all. Into this fractured world, in the final years of the 8th century, the first Norse longships appeared off the eastern coastline. They came first for the monasteries, because monasteries held gold, silver chalices, and unarmed monks who could not fight back. Lindisfarne had already burned in England the year before, and Ireland's coastal monasteries were even softer, more isolated targets for raiders. Within a single generation, these seasonal raids stopped being brief visits and became something far more permanent and dangerous. The Vikings began wintering directly on Irish soil instead of sailing home again each autumn. By the 840s, they had built fortified camps called long forts along the country's major rivers and natural harbors. One of those camps sat on a wide, sheltered bend of the River Liffey. The Irish called this spot Dublin, meaning the Black Pool, and the world still knows it today by a shorter name, Dublin. Within a few decades, Dublin stopped being merely a raider's winter camp on foreign soil. It grew into the single most important Viking trading port anywhere in the Atlantic world. Silver, enslaved captives, and timber all flowed through its docks into a network stretching from Iceland to distant Byzantium. The Norse settlers of Dublin gradually married into local Irish families and adopted Irish names for their children. They fought in Irish wars for Irish reasons, because loyalty in this period followed profit far more often than bloodline. Some Irish kings even hired Viking mercenaries against their own rival Irish kings. Silver, after all, spent the same regardless of the god it was sworn to. By the 10th century, the boundary between Viking and Irish identity had blurred completely. Historians eventually coined an entirely new term for this mixed culture, Hiberno-Norse. But a blurred cultural line never meant a peaceful political one between these two rival worlds. Dublin remained, in essence, a foreign power sitting permanently inside Irish territory, collecting tribute and controlling trade routes. Whoever controlled Dublin controlled the single wealthiest city in Ireland and one of the richest trading ports in Northern Europe. And in the year 1014, the man determined to control it once and for all was already 73 years old. Brian Boru was not born to rule very much of anything at all. He came from the Dal G Cais, a minor dynasty based in what is now County Clare. It was a family whose ambitions were always far larger than its actual modest territory in western Munster. His own brother Mon held the kingship of Munster, one of Ireland's 4 ancient historic provinces. Brian spent his early adulthood as a guerrilla commander, fighting Norse raiders through the hills bordering the River Shannon. When Vikings from Limerick murdered Mon in the year 976, Brian did not mourn his brother quietly for long. He raised an army almost immediately, hunted down his brother's killers, and claimed the kingship of Munster himself within a single year. That alone could have ended his story. One more regional strongman securing one province among 100. Instead, Brian spent the following 2 decades doing something almost no other Irish king had ever managed before him. He simply kept winning, campaign after campaign, year after relentless year. He crushed the Norse of Limerick outright, absorbing their wealth and their experienced fighting men into his own growing war machine. He then turned east and south, forcing the proud kings of Leinster into submission one hard campaign at a time. By the 990s, Brian effectively controlled the entire southern half of Ireland, and his ambitions had turned firmly north. The reigning High King, Máel Sechnaill, was strong but visibly exhausted after decades spent fighting his own endless wars. In the year 1002, rather than risk a war that neither man could fully win, Máel Sechnaill formally submitted to Brian as High King. For the first time in generations, one single man held a genuine working claim over the entire island of Ireland. Brian did not simply want the title for its own sake. He wanted the substance behind it. He circled the country personally, conducting royal inspections, collecting tribute payments, and rebuilding monasteries damaged by 2 centuries of Viking raiding. Irish chroniclers eventually gave him a title no other Irish king had ever dared to claim, Imperator Scottorum, meaning Emperor of the Irish. But an empire built almost entirely on forced submission still needed one thing Brian never fully secured, and that thing was loyalty. Among the many kings he had personally humbled sat Máel Morda, King of Leinster, a proud man nursing years of quiet resentment. And in Dublin itself sat Sigtryg Silkbeard, Brian's own son-in-law, ruling a Hiberno-Norse city that resented Munster's grip on its trade. Brian had married Sigtryg's mother, a formidable noblewoman named Gormlith, binding the 2 rival families together through blood. That single marriage would not save anyone at all once the entire fragile alliance finally broke apart. Later, Irish and Norse storytellers gave Gormlith a reputation that outlasted almost every king in this story. She had already been married once to the King of Dublin before Brian, and once more after him to Máel Morda's own family line. Through these marriages, Gormlith connected nearly every major faction in the coming war through her own bloodline alone. Her son from her first marriage was Sigtryg Silkbeard, current King of Dublin and Brian's own reluctant son-in-law. Her brother was Máel Morda, the resentful King of Leinster, nursing a decade of humiliation under Brian's rule. When Brian eventually set Gormlith aside, the insult reportedly cut deep into a woman already tired of being traded between rival crowns. Sagas written generations later cast her almost as an Irish version of Helen of Troy, a woman whose grievances helped ignite a continental war. Modern historians treat these dramatic details with real caution, since sagas were written decades after the actual events occurred. What remains historically certain is simpler and considerably less romantic than the legend eventually became. Brian's fragile network of enforced alliances depended entirely on personal relationships that could shatter overnight under the right pressure. And in the year 1013, at a feast inside Brian's own hall, exactly that kind of pressure finally arrived. The spark, according to later chroniclers, was almost embarrassingly small and personal for a war this size. At that same feast, Brian's son Murchad reportedly insulted Mael Morda over a chess game and an old grudge involving a stolen tree. Whether that particular story is literally true or simply a storyteller's shorthand for years of accumulated humiliation barely matters here. What actually matters is the outcome that followed almost immediately afterward across the country. Mael Morda rode home to Leinster and began openly raising his province for outright revolt against Brian's rule. He needed far more than Leinster's own spearmen to seriously challenge Brian's formidable war machine, so he turned to Dublin. Sigtryg Silkbeard agreed to join the rebellion, and together the two kings sent envoys across the entire Norse world. The response they received was staggering for a war fought over one relatively small, distant Atlantic island. From the Isle of Man came Broder, a Viking commander described by chroniclers as wearing armor no ordinary blade could pierce. From the Orkney Islands came Sigurd the Stout, one of the most powerful earls anywhere in the Scandinavian north. Sigurd commanded a legendary raven banner, said to guarantee victory for whoever carried it, and death for whoever actually held it. Contingents arrived from Iceland, from the Hebrides, and according to some later accounts, even from distant Normandy. This was no longer a local uprising confined to one Irish province and one rebellious city. It had become a genuine international Norse expedition, converging deliberately on a single beach just outside Dublin. Brian, meanwhile, was gathering his own coalition, and it was far less unified than legend later chose to remember it. His army drew heavily from his home base in Munster, reinforced by loyal allies from Connaught in the west. Crucially, plenty of Norse and Hiberno-Norse warriors fought on Brian's side of the field as well. This war was never simply Irish against Viking, no matter how neatly later legend preferred to frame it. It was one coalition of competing interests against another coalition of interests, with ethnicity only one factor among several. Brian's old rival, Mael Secnall, the former High King, arrived at the muster with his own forces from Meath. Whether Mael Secnall's men actually fought that day, or quietly withdrew before the battle began, remains fiercely disputed among historians. What is certain is that Brian, now well into his 70s, would not personally swing a sword in the coming battle. Command of the field would instead fall to his eldest son, Murchad, the very man whose insult had started this entire war. Brian's own coalition, in other words, was held together by exactly the same fragile loyalty he was marching to punish in his enemies. Medieval chroniclers, both Irish and Norse, loved to dress real history and supernatural warning signs before any major battle. The most famous account comes from Nijal's saga, written in Iceland more than a century after Clontarf actually happened. In it, a man in Caithness reportedly witnessed 12 Valkyries weaving a loom strung together from human entrails and severed heads. As they wove, the Valkyries chanted a grim prophecy promising grief for Ireland that would never grow old in memory. Broder himself, according to the same saga tradition, suffered a string of nightmares in the days before the battle. He dreamed of blood raining from the sky, of weapons rising up on their own to attack him, and of ravens circling overhead. His own men reportedly begged him to abandon the campaign entirely after hearing these unsettling dreams described aloud. Broder refused, reportedly declaring that the omens meant something else entirely, that Brian's death alone was already fixed. What do you do when every sign around you promises victory for your side, but death for you personally? Modern historians read these vivid stories less as literal supernatural events and more as narrative devices layered on afterward. They reveal how completely Clontarf's outcome reshaped later imagination, turning one messy Irish succession war into pure myth. Strip away the ravens and the Valkyries, and what remains is still a genuinely enormous gamble for everyone involved. Two international coalitions were converging on one narrow beach, and neither side truly knew what waited for them there. By April of 1014, both armies were converging on the exact same narrow strip of land northeast of Dublin. The Irish called this marshy coastal plain Clontarf, meaning the meadow of the bull, an oddly pastoral name for a slaughterhouse. Brian's forces approached from the west, deliberately cutting off any clean retreat back into Leinster's interior heartland. The Dublin and Leinster armies gathered instead along the shoreline itself, backed directly against the sea. They were further reinforced by the entire Viking fleet, which sat anchored ominously just offshore, waiting for the tide. This particular positioning would matter enormously once the fighting actually began later that same morning. One side was fighting with an open route home available. The other was fighting with only the ocean behind it. Good Friday fell on April the 23rd that year, a date loaded with heavy religious weight for a devout king. Some later chroniclers claimed Brian refused to personally fight on the single holiest day of the Christian calendar. Instead, he reportedly chose to pray quietly in his tent, while his sons commanded the entire field for him. Whether that specific detail is pious legend or literal historical fact, it captures something genuinely true. Later generations wanted to remember Brian making one final sacrifice, rather than simply pursuing one final conquest. As dawn broke slowly over Dublin Bay, the two armies faced each other across roughly 2 kilometers of open, exposed ground. Estimates vary wildly across surviving sources, but a reasonable middle figure puts each side near 4,000 to 7,000 men. On one flank stood Broder's mailed Manx warriors, alongside Sigurd's hardened Orkney veterans, raiders who had fought from Scotland to the Hebrides. Facing them stood Brian's core Dalcassian warriors, the same disciplined Munster men who had spent 30 years hunting Vikings through Clare. Neither side had brought siege equipment, meaningful cavalry numbers, or anything resembling the layered formations common in continental European warfare. Most fighters carried a round wooden shield, a single-edged sword or a broad axe, and whatever mail they could personally afford. Helmets were simple iron caps, not the horned fantasy of later popular imagination, and armor separated the wealthy from the common spearman. A wealthy Dalcassian noble might fight in a full mail shirt reaching to the knee, while a poorer levy fought in leather and wool. This gap in equipment would matter enormously once exhaustion set in, and reflexes began to slow across both packed lines. This battle would be settled the old, brutal way, shield against shield, axe against sword, for as many hours as bodies could physically endure. The battle opened not with an immediate charge, but with a feint, as the Viking fleet appeared to pull back from shore. Modern historians generally read this maneuver as a deliberate attempt to draw Brian's forces forward and break their tight formation early. If that genuinely was the intended plan, it barely worked at all once real fighting actually started. Both shield walls simply collided head-on across the open plain within only a few opening minutes. There was no room here for the layered, hidden traps that other medieval commanders elsewhere might have built from hills. This was 2 centuries of accumulated grievance compressed into one flat, muddy field with no terrain left to exploit. The air filled with the ring of iron on iron, the wet crack of axes through wood, and men screaming over the wind coming off the bay. Murchad, commanding personally in his elderly father's place, reportedly fought at the very front of the entire line. Chroniclers describe him wielding a sword in each hand, cutting down opponent after opponent as the fighting ground relentlessly onward past midday. Broder's men, in their supposedly unbreakable mail, proved considerably less invincible than legend claimed. Once Dalcassian axes found gaps at wrist and neck. Sigurd the Stout carried his own raven banner forward personally, after bearer had already fallen fatally beside him. According to the sagas, he died still carrying it, fulfilling the old prophecy that promised the banner victory, but its bearer death. By mid-afternoon, the exhausted Leinster and Dublin line finally began buckling badly under the relentless pressure of Brian's advancing coalition. What followed was not a clean, orderly retreat, but a total collapse, as panicked fighters broke ranks entirely and ran. This was the exact moment the coastline itself effectively became a weapon that nobody involved had actually planned for. The tide had come fully in while the 2 sides were fighting, and the escaping ships now sat stranded far out past the shallows. Salt water mixed with blood along the tide line, and the sand itself grew too slick and churned for footing. Warriors still wearing full mail, exhausted from hours of brutal close combat, plunged straight into the water anyway. It was still better in that moment than facing the spears chasing them from behind. Many never reached any ship at all. They were dragged straight under by the very armor that had protected them for years, and now killed them within minutes. Broder, meanwhile, had slipped quietly away from the main collapse and circled directly behind the Munster lines during the chaos. He found Brian's tent only lightly guarded, the elderly king inside praying rather than fighting, exactly as later legend remembered him. Broder struck the old king down where he knelt. He killed the 73-year-old High King on the one single day Brian had refused to carry a weapon. Broder himself did not escape that moment for long, caught almost immediately afterward by Brian's returning guards and killed inside that same tent. Murchad, the very son whose careless insult had started this entire war, died of his wounds later that same evening. By the time darkness finally settled over Clontarf, both rival sides had lost commanders who could genuinely never be replaced again. Technically, Brian's coalition held the field once the fighting finally stopped that evening, which by the era's rules made this his victory. Was it still a victory, if the man who won it never stood a chance to see it? But nobody who actually walked that blood-soaked beach the next morning would have called it any kind of real triumph. Brian himself was dead, murdered inside his own tent on the one day he had chosen not to fight. Murchad, his heir and the battle's true field commander, was dead as well, alongside Murchad's own teenage son, Tuardelbach. In a single brutal afternoon, the aging High King had lost the 2 men most likely to hold his fragile empire together afterward. On the opposing side, Mile Morda of Leinster lay dead on the field alongside a significant portion of his own fighting nobility. Sigurd the Stout of Orkney was gone too. buried somewhere beneath the very raven banner he had died carrying into that final charge. Brodir was dead as well, executed almost immediately for killing the High King inside his own supposedly protected tent. Sigtryg Silkbeard, remarkably, survived the entire day by remaining safely behind Dublin's stone walls throughout all the fighting outside. He would go on ruling Dublin for another 2 full decades afterward. It was a strange final irony, given how much blood had been spilled that day to challenge him. Total losses across both exhausted armies are estimated anywhere from several thousand men to considerably more, though exact numbers remain genuinely impossible to verify. What historians do agree on is that an extraordinary share of an entire generation's leadership, both Irish and Norse, died within one single day. Entire noble bloodlines on both sides simply vanished from the historical record within a few bloody hours near that shoreline. Sons who should have inherited kingdoms instead lay beside their fathers, and titles that had passed for generations suddenly had no living claimant left. This is part of why Clontarf felt less like an ordinary battle and more like a controlled, catastrophic implosion of an entire political generation. Clontarf did not drive the Vikings out of Ireland, whatever later national legend eventually claimed on Brian's posthumous behalf. The real lesson of that Good Friday was never simply Norse against Irish. It was about how loyalty forced by conquest breaks apart in the exact moment it is needed most. Dublin remained a Norse-ruled trading city for generations afterward, still trading actively, still minting its own coins, still very much alive economically. What Clontarf actually ended was the real possibility that Dublin, or any single Viking power, could conquer the whole island outright. The international coalition gathered at Clontarf was drawn from Orkney, Man, Iceland, and lands beyond. Arguably, it was the last serious attempt anywhere at exactly that kind of conquest. After that Good Friday, no Norse force ever again assembled on anything close to that scale to challenge Irish sovereignty as a whole. Brian's death also shattered the fragile, hard-won unity he had spent 30 years carefully building across a famously fractured island nation. Without Murshad alive to inherit the throne, Brian's own dynasty collapsed into decades of bitter internal succession disputes among his surviving relatives. The old system of competing provincial kings, briefly and forcefully interrupted by one extraordinary man's ambition, simply reasserted itself again within a generation. Mael Sechnaill, the former High King who had submitted peacefully to Brian back in 1002, reclaimed the High Kingship amid the ensuing chaos. In that narrow political sense, Clontarf's most immediate result was almost a strange return to exactly where Ireland had started decades earlier. Ireland would not have another genuine High King with real, uncontested authority over the whole island for a very long time. The dream of a single unified Irish crown, one Brian had chased his entire adult life, quietly went dormant for nearly 2 centuries. When it resurfaced again, it would not be answered by any native Irish dynasty at all. It would instead be answered, in the 12th century, by Anglo-Norman invaders arriving from across the Irish Sea. And yet something had genuinely, permanently changed beneath the surface of Irish politics after that single Good Friday battle. Hiberno-Norse Dublin, having decisively lost its own bid for outright regional dominance, gradually settled into a permanent, integrated role within Irish society. Within roughly a century, the descendants of Viking settlers and the descendants of Gaelic kings were, in many families, simply the same bloodline. The war that was supposed to finally decide whether Ireland belonged to Norse or Irish rule ended, eventually, by making that entire question meaningless. Today, Clontarf is a quiet, affluent suburb of modern Dublin, its coastline entirely reshaped by 9 centuries of land reclamation and steady urban growth. Stand near that shoreline on a calm morning, and it genuinely takes real effort to picture 7,000 armored men fighting there until sunset. A small cross and a scattering of local monuments mark the memory now, tucked quietly between rows of houses and a busy coastal road. But the story Clontarf tells has clearly outlasted every single stone marker ever raised in its honor. It is the story of an old man who spent his entire life trying to force one fractured island into a single nation. It is the story of a war that began, of all things, with a chess game and ended by reshaping an empire's foundations. Brian Boru did not live to see whether his vision of a united Ireland could genuinely survive without him. What does it actually mean to win a war you never lived long enough to see finished? In many real ways, it did not, at least not for centuries afterward, and never quite in the shape he had originally imagined. But no Irish king before him, and arguably none after him for a very long time, ever came this close to holding the entire island in one hand. He died kneeling quietly in a tent, rather than standing tall with a sword, and history remembered him anyway. Sometimes the war that changes everything is not the one that gets won cleanly on an open field. Sometimes it is simply the one that finally refuses to let the old, broken world stay exactly the same. Thank you for watching. If you want more forgotten wars that quietly reshape the world we actually live in, subscribe so you never miss the next one.